All right, let's. We got the camera going. Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up. All right, here we go. All right, so again, guys, welcome. Jim Lake with Viking Corporation, Vice President of Training, and basically what we have set up today is an overall exploration of NFPA 25 based on primarily what the common questions are. The questions that we're going to set up today are not necessarily the hardest questions, but one of the things we need to understand about NFPA 25 that's different than, say, NFPA 13 is that NFPA 25 has a lot of opinions written into it, and a lot of people with varying opinions that work on the committee that writes it. So in a sense, it has a lot of discussions about all right, what's the appropriate means to inspect, what's the appropriate means to test something or to maintain it. And as opposed to NFPA 13, which when we take a look at the laws that govern kind of how water flows through a sprinkler system, it's physics. There's basically calculations, and at some point, every argument is going to run into, well, the law of physics. How much water can we put through that pipe? How much pressure can the pipe take? How much, how does water flow out of that sprinkler? So in NFPA 25, a lot of this was maintenance. A lot of these, is opinion. So some of it has got some hard data behind it. A lot of it doesn't. It's just common best practices that kind of built this. So what you wind up with a lot of is whenever we ask these, when we ask these 20 questions on 25, you play this game of 20 questions, a lot of time depending on your perspective coming in, you may have a different answer, and you may hold that answer to be absolutely true, but it's going to be a little different than the person on the other side here. And there's no ultimate law of physics or anything that says, no, it's going to have to work this way because water is only going to flow through a pipe this way. In this case, you've got the building owners on NFPA 25 that deal with NFPA 25. They own the system. Then you have the authorities having jurisdiction who have the responsibility for applying the law, the state law that requires sprinkler systems to be inspected, tested, and maintained. And then you've got the contractor whose job it is to help the owner comply with the law. And the law is NFPA 25. So how does the contractor then, through their knowledge of NFPA 25, help the owner who really doesn't know much about NFPA 25? They hardly know that they've even got a sprinkler system in the building, and they're only hoping that it doesn't go off when there's not a fire. I mean, they really don't want it to ever go off. So this becomes the big challenge when we're putting together when we're having discussions about what's the best practice, what truly is the best practice for inspection, testing, and maintenance. So to start with, we'll give you some data, a little bit of data. First of all, why do we have inspection, testing, and maintenance? Is the first big question that you can ask. And primarily, we have inspection, testing, and maintenance, even though we've got a 95% success rate. Sprinkler systems are 95% successful, or successful 95% of the time when asked to do something over years and years of collecting data from NFPA, through the Fire Analysis and Research Division. We've shown that 95% success of the time, they are successful in doing exactly what we've designed them to do. So what this means is we take a look at that. How did we get there? How did we get to 95% success rate? Well, we basically have rules that say in NFPA 25, keep your valves open. Because in that 5% of the time when sprinklers failed to operate, water didn't even reach the fire. Well, if the sprinklers failed to operate, and because water didn't reach the fire, that's typically a closed valve. So keep your valves open, 55% of the time. Manual intervention, another 17% of the time. That's somebody closing the valve after the fact. after the fire's already started. Now that may be a mistake, or obviously it would be a mistake, or somebody just not understanding also what that valve was controlling, or maybe thinking that the fire was out. Anyway, we've got some real issues here, but this adds up to what, about, I don't know, 72% of the time you're looking at 72% of the time you're looking at simply a closed valve. So this becomes, why ITM? Because stuff happens. All right, we run into damaged components, we have a lack of maintenance, and 25 helps us to maintain, number one, maintain the 95% success rate, but also helps us to identify where those problem areas are that can maybe even make it better. So the standard NFPA 25, why 25? Well, 25 is actually a conglomeration of a lot of standards that used to have, up until 1992, they had their own inspection, testing, and maintenance guidelines. NFPA 13 had a document called NFPA 13A. NFPA 14 had a document called NFPA 14A. And then some of the other installation standards for fire pumps and underground piping and things like that, there were chapters on inspection, testing, and maintenance, or maintaining your system. But it wasn't until 1992 that all of those particular items were pulled out of the installation standards, or part of that part of the installation requirements, and put into their own document of NFPA 25, which handles all of them. So the arrangement here in NFPA 25 is basically the chapters are, you've got your administrative chapters up front, then we go into sprinkler systems, standpipe, private fire service mains, and fire pumps, all pulling out of the installation requirements, pulling the inspection, testing, and maintenance out of their installation standards, such as for fire pumps it was NFPA 20. And it goes in further into the water storage tanks, fixed water spray systems, foam water sprinkler systems, water mist systems, all the way down through. And we have a couple of system maintenance issues and items at the end of the standard. But the whole idea was to take all of these ITM provisions, put them in one book, because it's one system, really. Even though there are various parts of it with various installation standards that address different items, it's really one system, okay, all of it together. And so this takes a very systematic approach in one document to all of the issues.
That's a good idea, because I've been on many other buildings, and many of the employees, they don't know how to handle it. They don't know how to actually, if the inspector or the company to make maintenance, they don't know how to drain the lines, or for accidental occasions or something. They don't know how to handle it.
Right, they don't. And that's a great point, in that what we're going to find out is the person that's most responsible for the system is the one that knows the least about how that whole system operates, and that's the owner. And yet, when we get into some of these questions, you're going to find out, no, these are the guys that really actually are responsible for this.
Yeah.
So the standard itself then sets up with a number of annex materials, kind of explaining some of the provisions that are in the standard. But so this is the document that we work with, and it's been adopted since 1992, just about every 3 years since then, in 3-year cycles. So each time changing a little bit, so you need to be careful. We're going to base this presentation, this conversation, on the 2017 edition, but here in the state of Florida, I think it's on the 2011 edition, and various other states have different requirements. So it's really important to know what edition of the standard is being enforced in your area, so that you can know which.
So it's still the same NFPA book.
Right. It's still NFPA 25, but it's just the 2011 edition, which was the edition I was involved with when I worked at NFPA. So basically, but this changes every 3 years or so. So you need to know which one is adopted in the state. So just because the 2017 edition is the most recent doesn't mean that by law it's the law in the state of Florida, because it has to go through its own administrative process here to be adopted. and that usually lags 1 or 2 editions behind the current edition in NFPA 25. So let's talk a little. Let's start off with, as you mentioned earlier, who's responsible. Let's talk a little bit about that responsibility, because once again, these are not necessarily difficult questions. There's not a lot of science behind most of these questions in this top 20 that I've culled out here. In fact, there's very little, science and rules and things like that go along with that, physical rules. It's mostly best practices and opinion, all right, that has kind of made its way through the committee process, and the committee of 30 people or more, 32 now, basically through consensus processes said, okay, that's what we're gonna do. That's the rule that we're gonna land on. So somebody proposes something, they talk about it, and they say, yeah, this is best practice. But let's take a look at first what is the responsibility of the inspection technician. Now, when I say inspection technician, when we're talking about this individual, I'm referring to the individual in this case as the person that's out there representing the sprinkler contractor doing the inspection or doing the test or doing something in the name of the sprinkler contractor. Okay, this is the individual out actually perhaps walking through the building, doing the tests and doing inspections. So what's the responsibility of the inspection technician? Basically, the answer here is to know NFPA 25 and to apply it to the system as they're walking through it. To know, number one, what's the function that they're there for. To know what the requirements are about that function that they are there for, whether it's an inspection, which is very different than testing, and very different than maintenance, and all three of those processes are defined in NFPA 25. So what we wind up with is that technician's responsibility is to help the owner comply with the law by applying the rules of NFPA 25. Okay, that's really his only his or her only responsibility, is to make sure they know 25, apply it, fill out the forms, stay within the scope of NFPA 25, but mostly help the owner comply with the law. What's the responsibility of the authority having jurisdiction? And once again, this becomes one of those issues where sometimes people have some different ideas about what exactly the responsibility of the authority having jurisdiction is concerned. When it comes to NFPA 25, now let's start with NFPA 25 as far as what their responsibility is in here. There is not much that that NFPA 25 says about the authority having jurisdiction. There's a couple of places where, obviously we identify them, but they have a much bigger role in the whole inspection, testing, and maintenance responsibility. They have the responsibility of enforcing the law, that says NFPA 25 is the document that the owner will use to inspect, test, and maintain their system. So they've got a responsibility under administrative law of the state to make sure that the law is being enforced. Okay, make sure that the law is being applied and the owners are obeying it. This becomes pretty tricky because as you'll find, ask any authority having jurisdiction, and they don't have the manpower. And myself as a former fire code inspector, the manpower just isn't there to get into all the buildings with all these systems and everything else. So it's a challenge, it's a big challenge for them, but that doesn't change the fact that is their only job, is to enforce the law. NFPA 25 has a number of things about it or in it that the inspection technician does that the authority having jurisdiction, by virtue of getting the reports, can become aware of. But we need to be careful about kind of mistaking that that's a requirement of NFPA 25 to give that material to the authority having jurisdiction as far as the inspection technician is concerned. So we'll get to that in a moment, because the last one is then, what's the responsibility of the owner? Well, we're going to find out that NFPA 25 has a lot to say about what the responsibility of the owner is. Mostly, it's to make sure that in generality, it's to make sure that NFPA 25 is applied. is to make sure that he's complying, that they are complying with NFPA 25 for the inspection, testing, and maintenance of the system. So what's interesting then here is, what we wind up with is, in a situation like this, you've got the owner of the building here, and you've got the inspection technician over here. You can kind of form a triangle, and you got the AHJ over here. Okay? So the inspection technician, first of all, the owner owns they own it. Okay? They own the system and are ultimately responsible for its care. Then we've got how do they do it? They don't know how to handle it. You were saying they have absolutely no idea what's going on with that particular system. They know when the lights go out that they've got a problem. They got to get an electrician. They know if the plumbing backs up, they got to go and get they know these things, and they're not trying to be anything else. Okay? But these are active systems that they interact with every day. Hopefully, what they're hoping for really is that they never have this other thing operate. And so they may never know what that thing is up in the ceiling that they've got there. They know it does something, and they've seen it on the movies that a bunch of water comes out, and they hope to God it never happens in their building. So they may or may not know a whole lot about your system that you got in that building. So what do? They say, well, my gosh, the AHJ over here has adopted a law that says I gotta comply with NFPA 25. How am I going to do that? Okay, well, there's a contractor out here that does inspection, testing, and maintenance. So we go with the contract. So we have a contract now. And this is the relationship that sets up by contract with the with the inspection technician, right? This is not a requirement of NFPA 25 that you do this. So this is a contract here. NFPA 25 here. Okay? So the AHJ is going to be making sure this is happening. The contractor is going to make sure, if the contractor comes in, he's got the best job. He said, I'm going to help you. I'm going to help you obey the law. That's what I'm here for. Are you here to inspect my system and oh my gosh, no, I'm here to help you obey the law. All right? So this exists here. This exists by requirement in NFPA 25. We'll talk about the records a little bit later on, who's responsible for record keeping and how it kind of travels. And then in some cases, there is a relationship set up here. And that's set up by state law or local law. Local administrative law or state law. What I mean by that is, most of the time, under contract, the inspection technician is simply going to, or the inspecting contractor, is simply going to give all that information back to the owner. Boom. That's what's basically set up under contract. The owner now has the particular documentation on their system. NFPA 25 then says, okay, you maintain it, you own it, it's all your records. The AHJ will request it whenever they want to do it. If they're coming in to do a building inspection, a fire safety inspection or something like that. In some cases, and the case is here in the state of Florida, the authority having jurisdiction also will make the request. There is a request that, kind of a standing legal request, that the inspection technician, the contractor, also submit to the authority having jurisdiction. Now, the reason for this is typically that we want to make sure that whatever violations or corrections are needed that are found, that are discovered by the contractor, kind of go to, not just back to the owner, but to the enforcer. So it kind of helps make sure that everything, this regulation here helps make sure that everything kind of flows, that the owner actually does and maintains the system, because they're life safety systems in a lot of ways. All right, these are systems that are very important to the life safety within the building. big challenges here are the fact that, you know, the owner can sometimes see this as being, wait a minute, you're backdooring me into the AHJ, and it can cause some, you have to have a lot of communication here with your owner and the AHJ and the inspection contractor to let them all know that, no, this is just state law. I've got to make sure that, you know, my information goes up here, the official information on the inspection goes here, but I also may be required to do that. So you may be hearing from them, from the AHJ. Yep, go ahead.
If the owner knows the NFPA 25 rules and everything, he can't handle that in the house. I'm saying.
Yes, there are certain things, and we'll get to that. We'll get to that in a couple of questions. It's great. You know, that is one of the 20 questions. Who can do this work?
Yeah.
Can an owner do some of this work in NFPA 25 as long as they know NFPA 25? Yes. Yes, there is a, you know, kind of a way when we talk about the qualifications of the people doing the work. Yeah, we can get there.
Thanks.
All right. So we kind of went all the way around that where they outlined. That's where they're outlined. In all of these responsibilities, we've got the responsibility of the owner is detailed in NFPA 25. The responsibility of the inspection technician is detailed in the contract with the owner. They have to know NFPA 25, but they can't apply NFPA 25 until they're under contract with the owner to do so. So they need to know the contract, and they need to know, the inspection technician needs to know NFPA 25. All right, they need to be qualified to do that. And where are the responsibilities outlined for the AHJ? In administrative law. That's what they do. They enforce the fire code. And the fire code adopts 25 that says it needs to be, that your systems need to be maintained in accordance with this document. Okay. So when we take a look at the owner's responsibilities in particular, you covered when I said there's a lot of detail in this. It's in chapter 4 of NFPA 25, contains the details for what the responsibilities are for the owner, or what's called his designated representative. Now, his designated representative can be anybody, like could be a property manager. It could be the tenant of the building, based on their lease agreement, that all of a sudden the tenant becomes responsible for maintaining systems. But primarily, when we look at chapter 4 and the detail of the responsibilities of who's responsible for this system in NFPA, as far as NFPA 25 is concerned, the owners or designated representative, it has a lot of details here that they're responsible for. First of all, it says very clearly that they're responsible for inspection, testing, and maintenance of the system, period. It says they're also responsible for the buildings. Well, that's set up anyway. That's just legal. That they own the building, they're taking care of the building for the owner. So they need to maintain the building at a temperature that's commensurate with making sure that the system's water doesn't freeze or anything like that. They also need to, they're also responsible for accessibility. When I go through a building and I'm doing an inspection as an inspection technician, I need to be able to see the system wherever I can, to fill out the inspection forms and make sure that the system's operating properly. So I need to have accessibility. Now, that could be the riser room, it could be any other room within the building. We need to be able to do that. It's the owner's responsibility to make notifications. If we're going to be flowing water, having alarms going off in the building, or transmitting alarms around to alarm facilities or the fire department or something like that, we got to make sure it's the building owner's responsibility to make those notifications that things are going to happen in their building, that people need to be aware of. It's also once we do all the inspection, testing, and maintenance, and there is a list of corrections or repairs that are brought out, this also becomes their responsibility to get them done, to get the corrections and repairs done. Now here's where things get a little, in this particular case here, where it comes to changes, this is where it's necessary to really have some education go on with the owner. Now this education with the owner can come from the inspection technician or the authority having jurisdiction. Mainly it's going to come from the authority having jurisdiction through application of the fire code. So it may come as a violation if it comes from the AHJ. But it's the owner or owner's responsibility to understand that any change in the occupancy classification of that building, for example, if this room here suddenly went from a classroom into a storage room, that's a change in occupancy. That's a change in the challenge to the sprinkler system, all right? So it's the owner's responsibility to understand that any change in that occupancy classification may have an impact on the sprinkler system. Also with the use of the space, or the processes or materials that are being stored in that space. So any change within that particular space, including any kind of physical restructuring within that space, all needs to be understood that we have to, it could have an impact on the sprinkler system, could create locations in that building where there was a sprinkler, suddenly you put up a couple of walls and you've got a space that doesn't have a sprinkler in it. This is the owner's responsibility to understand that those changes need to be handled. It's not necessarily, and we'll talk about this later, the inspection technician's responsibility to know that these things have happened. The inspection technician is simply there looking at the system, looking at the function of the system. It's the system functionality, not whether or not something's changed underneath it. That's not an evaluation that the inspection technician is either qualified to make or required to make by NFPA 25. All right, this is just an individual who's going in and looking at the system, looking at system functionality. And that's really the only application of NFPA 25 as well. So how we set this up is through the scope of the document itself. So NFPA 25 has a scope. All NFPA documents, all 300 of them, have a scope statement. And that helps the committee write the document within a certain, within a certain guidelines. It doesn't, in other words, the NFPA 25 committee can't go off and write installation requirements because that's the purview of the sprinkler committee, okay, the committee on installation. So that's their purview. However, the scope, the questions here become, when it comes to the, our top 20 or our 20 questions here is, scopes don't often change once they're established for a document. They rarely change moving forward. And so when the scope of a document does change, it's usually for clarification purposes. And that's what happened in 2014 edition. So why did the scope of the document change in NFPA 25 in 2014? And what impact did that have on the standard? All right, what impact did this particular change have on the standard? Well, in order to ask that question, we have to understand something about the scope. In order to answer these two questions, we have to understand something about what the scope of NFPA 25 is. So the scope of a document, of any of the documents, basically says, well, here's what the standard applies to. Here's basically what where we're working. We're working in inspection, testing, and maintenance of sprinkler systems, water-based fire protection systems to be more exact. All right, and just as importantly, it also kind of by focusing in on this, by focusing in on what it does apply to, it also filters out these things that don't apply. So you can look at this particular rule and say, this is what we do. This is the scope of the standard. And by reversing that, you can say, okay, this is outside the scope of the standard, this particular activity or this particular regulation that we're trying to write. So the scope also establishes, basically in this particular case for NFPA 25, it's pretty straightforward. The scope establishes the minimum requirements for periodic inspection, testing, and maintenance. Boom. That's it. That's what it's looking to do. It requires coordination with NFPA 72, which is the fire alarm code. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But it requires us to coordinate with NFPA 72, because a lot of times these two systems interact either through a pre-action or a deluge system, where there's a direct interaction between alarm devices and our detection devices and alarm devices and our system, to other locations where if a fire alarm system is installed in a building in accordance with NFPA 72, it actually is required to monitor the conditions of our systems, whether it's the valves or the fire pump operation, things like that. So there's always going to be some interaction, one way, whether it's direct or indirect, with NFPA 72. NFPA 72 has its own inspection, testing, and maintenance requirements, and they don't always jive with NFPA 25. So we got to make sure that we're kind of making that work. So NFPA 72 in its scoping section actually says you're going to play along with 72 on this as well. It addresses the types of systems that are covered: water-based fire protection systems. It assumes that the system has been installed properly, and this is really, really important. This is really critical for the inspection technician to understand going into this, is that it assumes that the system has been installed properly. And it's necessary to assume that, first of all, but it's also proper to assume that, because a system's been installed in accordance with NFPA 13, it's been approved by the authority having jurisdiction, the building has a certificate of occupancy, so that's all that documentation put together would say the system's been installed properly. Right? It would lead us to believe that the system's been installed properly. And the reason we need to assume that is NFPA 13 changes every 3 years as well. The requirements for NFPA 13 change as well. So sometimes, you have a building that's built under one edition, or a system that's been installed under one edition, and a system that's been installed under under a newer edition could be very different. For example, the best example of that is that as mentioned in a previous session, that NFPA 13 changed back in 2001 area, something like that, from requiring to require in light hazard occupancies like this classroom, light hazard, you had to have quick response sprinklers. Okay, but I've got 80 years of buildings with light hazards having just standard response sprinklers installed in there. So what this means is that the inspection, it's not the job of the inspection technician to go in and say, this is light hazard, that should have a quick response sprinkler in it. No, the inspection technician goes in, does it look like it's in good shape? Yep, it'll operate, looks like it's fine. Done. It was an installation requirement. We're gonna assume going in with 25 that, yep, that's fine. It was installed in accordance with the provisions of the standard, the installation standard at the time. Okay, so that makes a big world of difference for the inspection technician. Okay, and they need, this is where, when we were drawing the triangle, and I said they need to know the standard. The inspection technician needs to know the standard, because they need to know that they don't go trundling out beyond the scope of NFPA 25 if they see something that looks like a design issue. And there's ways to determine that, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So it's not intended to address design deficiencies. You walk in, if the inspection technician walks in, and this room used to be a classroom the last time he was in here, and now it's a storage room. This is not something that he can define that can be cited in NFPA 25, design deficiencies. Okay, unsprinklered areas, things like that. It's just not there. There's not any place where they can cite it. That's a design deficiency. So while the inspection technician can't get there in NFPA 25, it's the AHJ The other part of that triangle, they absolutely can get there and cite them for design deficiencies or cite them for unsprinklered areas, things like that. Why? Because they've got the fire code behind them, and the fire code says you will have a properly sprinklered building, basically. So the scope is going to require requires corrective action in accordance with the appropriate design standard. If we're going to correct something, if we find a problem and we see that it needs to be corrected, NFPA 25 is not the document that says here's how you correct it. So you got to go back to the design standard. If we find problems, you're usually going back to the design standard to figure out what the correct answer is. It doesn't apply to 13D systems. Now, NFPA 13D is the standard for sprinkler systems in single family, 1 and 2 family dwellings, and modular housing, okay, manufactured housing. So, small homes, NFPA 13D, single family, 1 or 2 family dwellings, NFPA 25 does not apply to those sprinkler systems. NFPA, because they're private homes, you can't really get in and do an inspection. You can't mandate inspections on them. But NFPA 13D does have in its document, it does have a kind of proper care and feeding section of the system that you give to you inform the owners as to this is what is supposed to be done. Still the owner's responsibility. It just has to be the homeowner. Purpose is to provide a reasonable degree of fire protection through minimum inspection, testing, and maintenance. It's not trying to be overly regulatory on this one, not trying to be too heavy-handed. It's a reasonable degree. Now, this is one of those sections where if we say the purpose is to provide a reasonable degree of fire protection, and you get these 3 sides of the triangle all talking, they do have a different perspective as far as what the reasonable degree of fire protection is. The authority having jurisdiction basically is whatever the law says is the reasonable degree, and the contractor is, well, I've got to get in there, okay? I've got to make sure that the system operates, so I want to get in there as much as possible to make sure that the system operates. All 3 sides of the triangle want to make sure the system operates. They really do. They just have a different perspective in it as to what exactly is necessary to attain that, all right? So the document says a reasonable degree and then says, you guys go figure that out. We're going to work on it from here as far as frequencies of some of these, but in some of the other cases, you're just going to need to discuss what that is. You can use other types of ITM programs, different frequencies. Frequencies can change, things like that from what NFPA 25 is establishing, but it needs the approval of the authority having jurisdiction in order to do so. Remember, 25 is the law, so any modifications of the law are always going to need the AHJ's approval. So what's not in the standard? What we're trying not to do in NFPA 25, what we've tried to do is write all of our requirements so that there is no need for engineering judgment. In fact, we try to write the regulations so that there's no need for judgment at all within the requirements. Anytime that you get into, you're looking at the requirements, they're basically saying, if you see this, then that's an issue. Okay, if you see damage to the sprinkler, it needs to be repaired. The sprinkler shall be inspected every year. There's no judgment involved in these requirements. You have to do a fire pump test weekly if you're a diesel engine driver, it needs to run. Okay, it does this, and so there's no questions on this. There's no judgment in here. There's no judgment as to what the hazard classification
just
of
follow
this room
the
is.
standard.
Follow the rules. Yeah. Right. Just follow the rules. Now, it's because when we get into some of the statements that get into judgment, now all of a sudden you got all 3 people that have different perspectives. All right, and unfortunately there are some requirements in here that are a little fuzzy, and they don't particularly give you a lot of guidance on what it is that they mean. They've written some language in here that actually, where judgment comes back in. Now you got to work with each other to make that happen. The requirement for hazard analysis is not there, whether or not this room is a light hazard or an ordinary hazard. And regardless of what you think, when you're handing in your report or green tagging a sprinkler system or anything like that, you're not doing system certification. You're simply doing a status tag This is the status of the system that I found, and it appears to be in good condition. Everything appears to be in good condition. But you're not certifying the system itself. You're just saying it looks like it's in good shape. Whether or not it will actually do what we want it to do is was already established by the installation standard and certified when the building was put into given a CO. So in 2011, the scope read, and it continues to read now, this document establishes minimum requirements, periodic inspection, testing, and maintenance of water-based fires, including land-based and marine applications. So you can use it even on the Princess Cruise line that's out in the harbor right now. You could use it for the sprinkler system, or this water-based system is protecting that. All right, but in 2014, they added this, and actions to undertake when changes in occupancy, use, process materials, hazard, water supply that potentially impact the performance of the water-based system are planned or identified. So the first question was, why did it change? Well, it changed because this is in fact a true statement. The NFPA 25 does have within the responsibilities of the owner these requirements. So they added it in just to clarify the scope and to clarify that the work of the committee did include this type of, and this document does include requirements for the owner to do these certain things. What was the impact? That second question, question number 6, I think it was, what was the impact? Not much, really. On the whole standard as a whole, not much. Because all this did was clarify what was already there in the owner's responsibilities. This particular activity was already covered. It's just that they said, oh, wait a minute. They looked at the scope and they said, well, you know what? We haven't really said that that's in the scope of the standard. So they just added that in for clarification. All right, qualifications. This becomes a big issue around the country because it's going to differ from the state of Florida, state of Georgia, state of Alabama, New York State, Massachusetts, Michigan. It's all going to change. It all varies where you're going. So who can perform an inspection? As far as NFPA 25 is concerned, who can perform an inspection? Anybody that is capable of doing it. All right, they understand they're not necessarily. I wouldn't go so far as a hard qualification, but they've been trained to. They've gone to a couple of classes. They know what the system looks like and how it's supposed to operate. Basically, they can spot issues and walk through the building and fill out a form that says, yes, that sprinkler in that room is not damaged. It appears to be in good operating condition. Because that's the definition of an inspection. It's a visual check. The definition of an inspection is it's a visual check to ensure that the component or the system appears to be in operating condition and free of any physical damage. Well, you can train individuals within the business, within the building, to do that. Whether it's a maintenance guy or it's just a fire officer or whatever they've got in the building. You can do that, and they can fill out those forms. There's nothing really difficult about that. Who can perform a test is different, okay? Because once we start to perform a test, that's actually flowing water, putting your hands on a valve, manipulating the system, and evaluating the results, okay? Providing some sort of, you're providing the results for evaluation, and in some cases you're evaluating those results as well. This is where things get a little, things start to change. In the state of Florida, in order to do this kind of work, you have to be licensed. All right, in the state of Massachusetts, you have to be licensed. In the state of New York, no. In the city of New York, yes. So you get to all these different locations around the country, and this is again going to be based on regulation. It's going to be based on state law, state regulations that say a contractor doing work on fire sprinkler systems has to have a license to do so in basically covering all of the operations of that particular contractor. So if he does inspection, testing, and maintenance, there's that contractor, but you may have an inspector that is also required to get certification. or licensing. So you have a licensed contractor here in the state of Florida, but also their inspectors also need to go and get certification as well, the people that are doing the work for them. The inspection technicians, in order to be able to perform tests, in order to be able to perform inspections and such, you do, somebody on the outside, a sprinkler contractor, is going to need to be licensed. Same applies in many other states, that basically the contractor holds the contractor license, and then the individuals that are, in order to do that work, they also have to have certification as well. So the term qualified then is defined in NFPA 25, and it's a simple statement. It's a competent, capable person or company that has met the requirements for training in a given field to the age that's acceptable to the authority having jurisdiction. So be careful when we see things like in there it says somebody that's doing training probably, or somebody that's doing inspection probably needs to be trained. Okay, they need to be capable of doing that. That's far short of being qualified. All right, somebody that's doing tests needs to be, the standard will say needs to be qualified. So pay attention to where the standard uses terms like, okay, they need to be trained or they need to be qualified, because qualified means something quite different. It's a higher standard. So when we're walking through the building, this is another area as the inspection technician is going through the building. And we're filling out the forms and we're identifying the issues with the system. One of the things that comes up is, all right, we're filling out our forms, but we've got these terms here, and once again, what's happened is people don't necessarily understand why we're using these terms or where we're using these terms in the standard or why these terms are even in the standard. So why are deficiencies defined in the standard is the next question, question number 9. And then right along with that is, what's the difference between a pre-planned impairment and an emergency impairment, and why is that important? Or is it important that the two are different? So let's explore these deficiencies first, and we'll go through it. Let's explore these two, and then we'll answer, as we go through, we'll answer questions 9 and 10. So let's start off with impairment, because impairment's been an impairment, or a definition of impairment, has been in the standard, I think, since the beginning, since the 1992 edition. And basically, it is a condition here. What's most important here is it's a condition that basically says that the system is out of service, a portion of the system is out of service and will not operate. Okay? Condition where water-based system or a portion thereof is out of service due to work that has been planned and such revisions the water supply piping. Okay, so we're taking the system out of service. It will not operate. We're closing a valve. All right, and then the emergency impairment is where the protection of the system or portion thereof is out of order due to something unexpected. Okay, fork truck driver drives into my sprinkler and that wasn't expected. So basically, the difference between these two, pre-planned or an emergency impairment, is really what you say in reaction to that particular operation. Okay, if you say, I'm going to shut this valve and we're going to do work on it, that's a pre-planned impairment. If you say, uh-oh, that wasn't supposed to happen, we better shut the valve, that's an emergency impairment. But the two of them are the same. The system won't operate. The system is taken out of service. All right? Now, what's important about an impairment is that has a process to it. And that has a process that's detailed at length in Chapter 15 of NFPA 25. So if you say that system is impaired, Chapter 15 immediately becomes applicable. If there's a deficiency, which is something less than an impairment, then you don't go to Chapter 15. So this deficiency then is, for the purposes of inspection, testing, and maintenance, it's a condition in which a portion is damaged, inoperable, or in need of service, but it doesn't rise to that level of impairment. Okay, it's something that's the matter with, maybe I've got a broken valve handle, or gauge is bad, or something like that. It's inoperable, it's not working, but it doesn't but it doesn't mean the whole system won't operate or that component may not operate. When we get into looking at, if you go through and you start to look at sprinklers, anytime you go through and do an inspection in a building, you start to look at the sprinklers, there can be small amounts of paint, small amounts of schmutz on them, dust and dirt and things like that. Okay, we're not really sure if the system that sprinkler will operate or not, but we're pretty sure you need to clean it.
Yeah, okay. Just detail for the future.
Yeah, yep. So we're gonna take care of that. But it's not necessarily an impairment. Now the problem with deficiencies, and this is one of those things, remember I said earlier that there's no engineering judgment, that the committee has tried, and the document has tried since the beginning, to write out anything, to eliminate any judgment requirements in the standard, any calls for judgment in the standard. Well, unfortunately, critical deficiencies and non-critical deficiencies and deficiencies in general are all about judgment, okay? It's all about if not corrected, it can have an effect on the performance of the fire protection system. Okay, that's a critical deficiency. Here's a non-critical deficiency. It has to be corrected, but it doesn't have an effect on the overall operation of the system. Well, let's go back to my sprinkler up in the ceiling with schmutz on it. If that thing doesn't operate, is it going to have an impact on the, yeah, but it doesn't have that much, so maybe it will operate. We're not sure. What's that? That's judgment. The other challenge here with these particular definitions, and this is a little bit of inside baseball here for you, but is nowhere else in the standard are they used. Are these terms used? Nowhere else in the standard does it say if paint is on the sprinkler, this is a critical deficiency. That's a non-judgment statement. That's it. Period. End of story. They have some material in the annex that explains, that says if you've got just a little bit here or a little bit there, but what's that again? It's judgment. It's a judgment call, making it almost impossible to apply either of these two terms. That's where we start to get confused. The reason they exist is so that basically we don't immediately go to impairment. All right, the reason deficiency and all of this exists here is to find some sort of middle ground that says, oh yeah, we need to fix that, but we better but it's not an impairment. We don't want to shut the building down or anything like that. So that's the reason that they're there, but they're not being used right now in the body of the standard, which means they really have no meaning here in the definitions, in the terms. Not until the committee starts to write requirements that say this is a critical, or this absolutely is a non-critical. And that's going to be a tough one, because there's a reason that all that stuff's in the annex material, and it's because the committee of 30 couldn't agree on some of them. So they just left it in the annex material, and they probably should. If there is an impairment, if we say that system is impaired, the valve is closed, or I'm going to close the valve, or what have you, this is chapter 15 comes into play. So we have to have an impairment coordinator, somebody to watch over that impairment, to follow through with the fact that that system is down. We're taking necessary safety precautions while it is down, and we're going to put it back in service. So somebody's got to be able to watch that. We have a tag impairment system, or an impairment tag system that identifies those valves that have been closed. And they also identify on the fire department connection for responding fire department, hey, there are parts of this system that are shut down. So it identifies the impaired equipment. What equipment are we going to be working on? It manages either pre-planned or emergency impairments. And really the impairment plan, whether it comes to pre-planned or emergency impairments, that's just a time frame of how long it's going to take you to implement it. If it's an emergency impairment, you got water flowing, then you better be applying that impairment plan real quick. If it is a pre-planned impairment, then you got time to kind of sequence it out. Here's what we're going to do to shut it down. And then what are we going to do to bring the system back online? Reversing it all back out so that the system's back online. In a pre-planned impairment, then we have to determine the extent of the risk, extent and duration. How much of the building is going to be affected and for how long are we going to do that? And then right after that becomes a determination of the increased risk. And this is important because if we shut down a sprinkler system in a given portion of the building that happens to also have some high hazard operations in it, what are we going to do? What's that determination of risk? Because that's going to begin to, as we follow down through that logic, chapter 15 starts to outline, well, you better have a fire watch, or you better close that particular building down, or here's what we need to go through in order to get there, in order to make that, to mitigate that increased risk. Notify all the stakeholders in the building. Now, stakeholders in that building are everybody from the authority having jurisdiction, to the building owners, to the insurance company, to the occupants. Are you a stakeholder in this building right now? I am. I'm a stakeholder in this building right now. So how do you notify me if the system in this building is going to be impacted? Do you notify me? I mean, in certain cases. If I'm lying on a hospital bed in a hospital that's protected with a fire sprinkler system, am I a stakeholder in that building? Yeah, you bet I am. Are you going to tell me if the sprinkler system's down? Probably not. If I'm sitting in the critical care unit, you're probably not going to let me know. Okay? But people will know. All right? They'll let the necessary people know. The stakeholders in that would be the staff and everybody else that has to take care of me should anything start to go be a problem. Okay? But you're probably not going to notify me. If you can even get to me at CCU. So, anyway, implement the tag impairment system, and then make sure you may need to the impairment coordinator in the pre-plan arrange for the tools to be there, whether scissor lifts or anything else that might be necessary. The determination of the increased risk comes into play if it's greater than 10 hours in a 24-hour period. We may need to evacuate the building, establish an approved fire watch, maybe a temporary water supply depending on what the impairment is, and eliminate potential ignition sources. These are all part of that evaluation when we have an increased risk. And then restoring everything back is simply reversing it back out, okay? Taking the verification of operation, do the necessary inspections and tests, stakeholders are informed, and the impairment tags are all removed. So it's kind of a lockout, tag out coming, if you're familiar with that with electrical equipment. So you tag in, you tag out, and you document all that. All right, let's talk about internal condition of pipe, because there's a couple of times when we're looking at our system, when we go through the inspection, testing, and maintenance procedures. One of the things that we don't do on an inspection is look inside the pipe. All right, we don't tear the pipe apart. It's simply looking at it from the floor, looking at all of these components. When we do a test, and we're flowing water, we're still not taking the system apart and looking inside to make sure there's no corrosion or there's any problems. We may suspect issues based on the results we get from tests. We may have to pull off the faceplate of dry valves and things like that, or valves, in order to reset them. But that's not the same as an assessment of the internal condition of pipe. What we're looking for here is access to the interior of the piping system to make sure that it's not corroding, or that the corrosion that is occurring, because it'll occur. Anytime you have steel, oxygen, water, you're going to get some corrosion. But has it gotten to the point where it is now going to be obstructive? All right, there's going to be obstructive material created that's going to cause a problem with my sprinklers. So, what is an internal assessment of piping, condition of piping, and how often must I do an obstruction investigation? So, internal condition of pipe leads to these two basic questions, and this is found in Chapter 14 of NFPA 25. Chapter 14 details provides the answers for these two questions, because they're two different operations. First off, an internal piping condition, when we look at the internal piping condition in Chapter 14, this is basically what we're looking for here. Chapter 14, internal piping condition obstruction investigation prevention, and the possibilities of ice obstructions, and how to avoid them. So let's take a look at this assessment of internal condition first. First of all, this assessment of internal condition does have a frequency associated with it. You need to do it every 5 years. Right, so every 5 years, you're going to check for access the interior part of the pipe that checks for foreign, organic, or inorganic material. I'm not even sure what other material there is, if it's not organic or inorganic. I'm not sure. Cosmic maybe, but I'm not really sure. But that's what you're looking for. You're looking for material that's in that piping that could cause an obstruction. All right, that could impact the operation of our of the system, of the sprinklers. Now, in certain cases, you're not going to need to do that for non-metallic pipe because we're not really worried about corrosion in non-metallic. You do need to do it for dry and pre-action systems. They are required to do so, and you're going to need to do it in the cross mains as well. Okay, so the big challenge here then is, well, if I've got multiple wet pipe systems in the building, all right, let's just say I've got a building with 5 risers protecting a large warehouse, all those, well, let's make it an even number. Let's say 6 risers protecting a warehouse, a wet pipe system down here protecting our warehouse. I don't have to perform, what NFPA 25 says, I don't have to perform an internal assessment of the pipe on all of the systems every 5 years. I can alternate them, all right? If I can go system 1, 3, and 5, and then 5 years later do 2, 4, and 6. Unless I find materials in there during that time, and then I have to inspect all of them internally. Because if I've got a problem in one, chances are pretty good I may have obstructive material somewhere else. So basically what we're doing there, now before we get into the obstruction investigation, basically what we're looking for here is during an interior inspection of pipe, you pull the system apart. You take a couple of sprinklers off. Mostly now, what we're doing with this is either cameras draining the system and then running cameras up into the piping to do it to non-destructive methods of this, because we're not taking sprinklers off. So you can do X-rays or internal cameras and things like that to do your internal inspection assessment. That's quite different than an obstruction investigation. An obstruction investigation does not have a specific frequency to it. It has a triggering event. If something happens in or around my sprinkler system, I may have to do an obstruction investigation. And that obstruction investigation is pulling the system apart or running the camera up into the system to look for obstructive material. But there is no, where the internal assessment is every 5 years, there is no frequency for an obstruction investigation. If you have a defective intake for the fire pumps that are taking water from an open pond or a raw water source, they're supposed to go through these filters. If you've got a defective filter, you're going to do an obstruction investigation if you find in the inspection. Discharge of any obstructive material. If I'm running a 2-inch main drain test, all of a sudden I get something coming out, rocks, something, coming out of my discharge when we're going to do an obstruction investigation. Foreign materials in fire pumps and dry valves and check valves. Boy, you're going to know it if you've got a foreign material in your fire pump real quick. It's going to grind to a halt, or it's going to make a heck of a lot of noise. All right, so if you've got that, then you got issues that you're going to do that. You're an obstruction investigation. Any foreign materials, basically these three could just be combined together, saying foreign materials anywhere in the system. All right, discharge during a drain, discharge anywhere. You're going to want to do an obstruction investigation. Unknown material heard in the system piping. All right, so even if you're hearing it kind of rattling down the main, you want to make sure that that's going to be a trigger. Plugged sprinklers, plugged piping in the sprinkler system when you're dismantling during any kind of building alteration. If you're starting to do tenant work in a building, you start to pull the system apart, and you've got plugged piping there and evidence of an obstruction, then you're going to do the rest. Failure to flush the yard piping. If you've got a yard system out serving the building and it hasn't been flushed, going to need to do an obstruction investigation. Record of a broken pipe in the public main in the vicinity. Wow, this one's difficult, okay, because the way that that water flows through the systems anymore, it could be on a grid in a downtown area. How many blocks in a vicinity are we looking at here? How far do we say that particular break didn't have an impact on my system? So that's going to be a challenge. Frequent faults, trippings of the dry valve, indicating that there might be obstructive material in the valve itself. If the system is returned to service after an extended shutdown, which is greater than 1 year, all right, so if I shut my system down altogether, I've gotten approval to do that, the building's been evacuated, nobody's in there, it's been an abandoned building, but in order to kind of save the system, I've shut it down. Putting it back online. Any system that contains sodium silicate or highly corrosive fluxes in the copper lines, if you've got copper piping, then we're going to need to do an obstruction investigation there, any evidence there. System has been supplied with raw water source from the fire department. All of a sudden they draft out of a pond and pump it into my system. I'm going to do an obstruction investigation. Pinhole leaks. Pinhole leaks are one of the characteristics of microbiologically influenced corrosion. It's just one of them. There's a few others. But pinhole leaks are an indication of corrosion to a point where you probably have some material flaking off in the corrosion, and especially if it's mic, it's going downstream. And this is one where if you've got a 50% increase in the time it takes water to travel to the inspector's test connection from the time the valve trips during a full flow trip test when compared to the original acceptance test. So when we have an original acceptance test, a lot of times people will say, well, how long, if you ask the general question, how long should it take for water, what's the requirement for water flowing in a dry pipe system from the system valve to the inspector's test connection at the end of the system? Oftentimes the answer is 60 seconds, but it's not always the answer. Depending on what other components are in the system, you can have more than that. But you need to know, this is where you're going to need to know what the original test documents were, the original certification documents were for the system. Because you need, in this particular case here, and I can tell you also when you're comparing fire pump test curves, you're going to have to compare back to the original approving documentation for the system. So it's really going to be important that we have that particular information available to us as well. Because if we've increased by more than 50%, if I started off with 60 and all of a sudden I'm up to 100 seconds to deliver water there, that triggers an obstruction investigation. Okay, talking about these records. Is the contractor required by NFPA 25 to maintain inspection testing and records, inspection testing and maintenance records? No. Not the contractor. Now, yeah, the contract, it's smart for the contractor to do so, okay? But it's not required by NFPA 25 that the contractor maintain the records. Okay, the owner owns the system, therefore the owner owns the records. Who's responsible for providing the ITM records to the authority having jurisdiction? Now, what's that?
The owner.
The owner by NFPA 25. So the answer to this, though, remember I talked about earlier when we drew that triangle, we said the owner, but then the real answer is it depends. Because in Florida, also, the inspection contractor is. In the state of New York, no. Up in Georgia, no. It depends on the location and what the state or local regulations are about submitting those records. In accordance with NFPA 25, the owner owns the records. Okay? The authority having jurisdiction then requests those records, either by formal request or by just a recurring request that say records are always, you need to submit all the records. But remember, that communication is established, that relationship is established by NFPA 25 between the owner and the authority having jurisdiction. Okay? So a lot of times, it's basically the contractor. The contractor fills out the forms, gives them to the owner, and says, "You own them. I'm doing this to cover to make sure that I have a record of it as well." But but it depends on what the regulations are. That says whether I have to, as the contractor, provide this to the AHJ. That's outside the scope of NFPA 25.
Sometimes they give some copies just to get the business.
Sure. Yeah. Oh well. A lot of times, sometimes when you talk to contractors, they say, "No, we do the inspection for free. The records are going to cost you $1,000. My records are going to cost you." Okay. So that's the easy part. I'll just hold on to these for you until you pay me, and then I'll give them to you when the AHJ says, "What do you?" Yeah. That's another way of looking at it.
Yeah.
Like we hold it. But remember, you got to remember that the contractor. Remember what the contractor's got the best part in this whole thing. The owner owns the system. The AHJ has to enforce the law. The contractor is here to help.
Yeah.
I'm here to help you, Mr. Owner, obey the law. Okay, I'm not here to be a pain in the neck. There's a law that says you got to do this. You don't know how. I do. So let's figure this out. So inspection, testing, and maintenance, when it comes to records, and this is the established requirement here in Chapter 4 of NFPA 25. The owner is required to maintain all records, all right, maintained by the property owner. They need to be ready to be made available to the AHJ upon request. Now, once again, that may be a standing request that the owner has by regulation, local regulation. It says just forward them on in, okay? Just submit them online, whatever it is that you need to do. But all records need to be just automatic. Or it may be something that in most of the rest of the country, you don't have that kind of necessarily that kind of sophistication in, and there's a lot of sprinkler systems out there in towns that don't have that kind of automatic capability of submitting. So basically, you maintain them. I'll request them when I'm ready to do an inspection. Okay. We want to make sure, though, that the original test records, acceptance test records, are maintained. Hopefully, the building owner or within the building records, they have the original documentation of the system. I mean, we've been doing this for 100 years, so probably a lot of systems out there that don't have the original records. They may exist in the building or the fire department, from when the building got its certificate of occupancy. But again, these are important because as I showed you before with the obstruction investigation, you need to know what the original performance was. You need to know how that fire pump originally performed in order to compare it now 20 years later. Is it still performing within the necessary 95% range? Okay. Same thing with the dry system. So requesting there the original test records and the ITM records. Now sometimes NFPA 25 says you can get, you hold this year's ITM, you hold the original, this year's ITM, last year's ITM, and then this year's ITM records. And then you can kind of just 2 years worth of records and then original. That may change as well, okay? I've heard it all the way up to 6-7 years of retention. Sometimes they say don't ever get rid of them. We want to, and a building owner is really going to want to do that anyway sometimes to just show that they've maintained the system just in case anything has gone awry, if there's been any kind of problem with it, just for their records. But NFPA 25 doesn't require that kind of retention. The records should show what procedures, all of these records, these forms that are submitted by the authority, not by the authority, by the contractor, by the inspection technician. All of these records should show the procedure that was performed. Was it an inspection? Was it a test? Was it maintenance? Who did it? What was the required frequency of this particular event? What were the results and the qualified contractor's information? If it was done by a licensed contractor, then who was it? And so all of that information is now required by NFPA 25 as far as information on the list for the record. So we've established kind of a foundation here then of basically where NFPA 25 has come from. We've established some questions as far as where how it is established and what are the foundational requirements of NFPA 25. Let's get into some situations. Let's finish this out with a few situations that come up. And again, these are situations that have come up. These are not fake situations. These actually are, over time, we become aware of some of these. So during an inspection, it is noticed that storage is within 18 inches, the 18-inch minimum of the sprinkler level. So remember from our previous session, we said that 18 inches was the minimum that you could have for storage, clearance to the sprinkler, in order for the spray pattern to develop. The owner removes the offending boxes. Do you report it? Do you cite it on your report that's what you found, or do you say, okay, great, I don't have to put that on the form?
You have to say.
Yeah. I would say you'd cover yourself by saying, absolutely, I cited it, I saw it. Okay, I saw it, then I cited it because I can. Now you can say, and in a lot of cases, what some contractors will say is another note that says it was corrected while I was there. Okay, corrected while I was there. But don't ever overlook the fact that you found that condition, because what's going to happen as soon as you leave the building? It's going right back up there. And you want the proof and the signature and everything else that says, no, I said something, he signed it, okay, we corrected it, but no, we're not coming down to that argument of he said, she said. Well, no, he never said that to me. How about this? During an inspection, it is noticed that there are areas in the building where there are no sprinklers. Is this a violation of NFPA 25? So you walk in, you go down this corridor here, and there's been some renovation in the building. Okay, it's an older building. All of a sudden they're putting loft apartments in or something like that. It has a sprinkler system up above, but they've created this corridor in here, and they didn't drop sprinklers down into it. And now as the inspection technician, you're going through filling out your forms in NFPA 25, and you're saying, there's no sprinklers here. So what do you think? Is that a violation of NFPA 25?
Yes.
You think so? Yeah? Okay. And you're at a bit of a disadvantage because you don't have the standard in front of you. But is this a design issue, or is this an inspection, testing, and maintenance issue?
It's not a design. It's a new design.
It's the new design. It's the new design.
Yes.
Right. Something didn't happen during the renovation of the building, and that requirement was based on the fire code. That corridor is sprinklered is a requirement of the fire code, and then the installation standard NFPA 13. The tripping point here is that you know something's wrong.
Yeah.
That the inspection technician is going through going, this is not right. But there's nowhere in NFPA 25 to cite it. There's nowhere in NFPA 25 that says that there are no unsprinklered spaces in this building, or there are unsprinklered spaces in this building, and therefore it's a violation. It's not there, okay? Because it's a design issue. Now, the way you typically handle this, is this a violation of 25? No. Is it a concern? Sure. Typically, the way this is handled by a conscientious sprinkler contractor or inspection technician who's in there is they will write an addendum, okay, or what's sometimes called an observation report, totally separate document, not related to their ITM report, and they'll say these are the things we observed. We're not guaranteeing that we caught everything that might be wrong with the system, but this is what we saw, and you may want to talk to us about fixing these, okay? Or you may want to, look into this a little further. Whose responsibility is it to do that?
Owner.
Owner's responsibility. Perfect. Always the owner, okay? Then you've got the documentation over here That's everything you can cite in NFPA 25, and you got this over here that says, well, I can't cite it, but it sure didn't look right. Okay? It's important. One of the things that's really important with filling out an inspection form, even in the comments section of the official NFPA 25 inspecting document, what's crucial to all of that is that you put only what you can cite in 25 on the report. So usually what I tell people is cite the problem, whatever the problem is. There's damage to that sprinkler or whatever it is, and then in parentheses go back into the standard, become familiar with the standard enough to go back in and put in parenthetical notes the section reference in 25 that you're noting. Okay? That's going to help on a number of ways. Number one, it's the practice of saying, I found it, it's there, so it's citable. Okay? The other one is, I cited it in the 2017 edition, and if it changes down the road a little bit, all right, I can say, well, wait a minute, that was what I cited at the time. Okay? So, is it a violation? No. Is it a problem? Probably. All right? But we need to go and get somebody else's opinion on that. During an inspection, there are certain locations in the facility that are off limits to the inspector for security reasons. Oh. How do I recognize this? All right, so I'm going through my building, and on the 10th floor is CIA Black Ops. Okay, there's a government facility on the 10th floor of a 20-story building, and you say, I need to get inspection. No, you don't. No, I'm sorry, you're not going in there because I'm not opening that door. Okay, so the point is, you've got this location. Okay, and it doesn't have to be anything. It could be anything, but you can't get in there. Access is denied for security reasons. What do we do with that? How do I handle that as a situation within NFPA 25, within my responsibilities as the inspection technician? Because that's all I'm there for. I mean, I'm there with the maintenance guy walking through the building. What do I do with that?
You notify that to the inspector, I'm saying to the fire department.
Okay, so you notify the fire department, and how am I going to notify the fire department? What's my only tool as an inspection technician right here, right now? So I got my form,
yeah.
Right? So unlike the observation report, which is something that is not related to NFPA 25, this is related to 25 because the building owner, remember, we said in chapter 4 that the building owner is required to give me access to the system in order to do the work I need to do. Well, I can't now. Now what?
You notify.
Note it. Note it down on that form, right on the form somewhere in comments that says, was denied access to. And then they'll sign up, the owner signs off on this as well. Okay? Look, you can't always get into places. That's just the way it's going to be. Okay? Sometimes, if you're doing an inspection at a nuclear power facility or something like that, it's like, yeah, no, I don't want to go in there. But,
I'm saying even banks sometimes.
In banks? Yeah. No, there's going to be all kinds of these little spaces around there. The point is, write them down. You're going to come across them in some of the, strangest places. Like, nope, sorry, can't get in there. Okay? Because it may also just be a condo building where they've sent it around to the condo. You got to inspect the condo buildings. They've sent it around to all the owners. Please let us in to take a look at your sprinklers. Oh, well, no. You got a whole bunch of them that either say no, or they're not there, or you can't get access. Whatever. Start writing down numbers. Start writing down unit numbers, things like that. Sometimes we have contracts that establish that already. That what I'm going to inspect is if the contract says I'm expecting the common areas only. That's why NFPA 25, the owner sits up here with all these responsibilities, and the contractor down here, what I said earlier was the contractor needs to know two things. They need to know 25, and they need to know it really, really well, and they need to know that contract really, really well. so that they don't trundle off into areas that are going to be problematic for them further down the line. All right, if you wander outside the scope of NFPA 25 and you write it down on your form and it's outside the scope of 25, boy, that gets into problems if you've got a liability lawsuit coming down later on. If there's anything gone wrong with that system, all of a sudden that documentation becomes a real problem because you wrote something on the official ITM form that's not citable in NFPA 25. Okay, that's why you want to make sure anything that's associated with 25 gets on those forms. Anything that's not associated with 25 is an observation. All right, judgment, and that's the best. That is the best way to look at this. Remember, I said we're writing. We tried to eliminate judgment. Well, if there's a judgment call in there, like you think that space should have sprinklers, that as soon as you start saying stuff like that, no, that's an observation. But if you can't get into a space, that's a fact. Okay, report the facts, and that's a fact. And accessibility is something that is supposed to be provided by the owner. Okay, another ITM situation. When conducting an inspection, in this case, it is noticed that a number of sprinklers appear to be obstructed by structural components of the building. Can this be cited? So remember yesterday, we were talking about, in that previous session, we were looking at the 3 times rule, and we were looking at the beam rule when we said obstructions to spray patterns. Okay, so in this particular case, I'm walking along, and I've got a sprinkler. I'm coming across my sprinkler right here, and I've got a beam right next to it. It's a false beam. It's obvious that they put it in later, and they said, yeah, we want to create a nice rustic look in this room, so we're going to put this false beam in. Or it could be that they put in ductwork. It could be anything, and it's right there next to my sprinkler. Can this be cited in NFPA 25? One of the things that we'll find out is no. It can't. Where was the rule? Where were the rules that governed this arrangement? Yesterday we were talking about them. NFPA 13. This is a design issue. As much as it pains you to look at it and see that, it's a design issue. Somebody put this too close. This is where things, like I said earlier, the owner is responsible for any kind of changes in the space. That means any kind of changes in the space. Even if you're running down, if you're putting in new ductwork or new lights or new anything, all of a sudden, that needs to be evaluated. But it needs to be evaluated to the rules in NFPA 13. So what do we do with this? The same thing we did with the sprinkler, the unsprinklered space. I can't cite it in 25, so basically what I say is sprinklers in XX room appear to be obstructed by the new beam that went in, or the new ductwork that went in. Appear to be. That's over on the observation report. Will that sprinkler work? Because I'm going through here on an inspection, and I'm only evaluating, does the sprinkler appear to be in operating condition and free of physical damage? That's an inspection, visibly. So I'm looking at that sprinkler. It appears to be in good operating condition, free of physical damage. It just happens to be maybe obstructed by this thing over here. But it'll operate. It just won't do it really well. Okay? So that's kind of the difference. If we're asking, what's the fact? The fact is this sprinkler is free of physical damage and appears to be in operating condition. Those are the facts. This is a judgment. Okay? Facts are reported, judgments are observed. Okay, is it permissible to have valves identified by numbered tags instead of signage with words? So in other words, I've got you will see this often, I've got a control valve. Let's see. I've got my control valve off here for my system. Now, NFPA 13 says that you have to have signage on all your valves. All valves need to be identified as to what they do. In this case here, though, I've got a little chain down here, and I got a tag that says 39. Is that permissible, do you think? Is that citable? Is that something that is wrong with the system? What do you think? Can that identify the valve?
Yes.
Sure. Are there certain locations, certain occupancies, where maybe you don't want the occupants knowing what that valve actually does? I can think of a few. Colleges and university dorms.
Museum.
Things, hotels maybe, where we've got partying kids coming in for spring break. Now, things like that, right. Institutions where we don't want people to know exactly what that valve does because it could be used for, problems. It could cause problems. Absolutely. This is permissible as long as somewhere accessible is a list of identifying what valves 1 through 39 do. Okay?
Location and everything.
Location and function. Okay? So that's certainly it's something that trips people up sometimes, but is certainly something that's permitted. Okay. How often is a fire pump with an electric motor driver required to run a no-flow test? All right. So what we have is fire pumps. Annually, we have to do a flow test. But on another frequency, we have to do what we call a churn test, or no flow. They just run for a certain amount of time and then stop. So we have two different types of drivers that drive fire pumps. We have a diesel engine. These are the most common anyway. A diesel engine or an electric motor. All right? The answer to this particular question is it depends. Because from 2011 to 2014 to 2017, the provisions have changed. Okay? It started off that they needed to be done, electric motor driver and diesel engine drivers needed to run weekly. Diesel engine drive needed to run for 30 minutes. Electric motors needed to run for 10. In 2011, the committee was given data that suggested that electric motor drivers were okay that actually you could increase the frequency. You could decrease the frequency. And so in the 2011 edition, it says that diesel engine drivers will run weekly, electric motor drives will run monthly. Right? Then in the 2014 edition, they said, hang on, wait, we didn't mean all electric motor drives. And they added in some modifications there depending on the occupancy that you're in. So now to the 2017, that's where we are. So before 2011, both of them were weekly. In the 2011 edition, it was weekly, monthly. And then in the 2014 edition, it was weekly and maybe monthly. Depending on, there's like 4 different variables in there on that system. So, the answer to that question is how often is, it depends. And again, it depends on not necessarily what is in the standard, but what is in the standard that's adopted in your state. So it doesn't matter right now what it says in the 2014 and 2017 edition here in the state of Florida. Why? Because the official document here in the state of Florida is the 2011 edition, okay, which is weekly, monthly. Now, be ready. This becomes problematic for contractors, mainly because there are certain facilities. If you're on a government facility or if you're in a hospital that is governed by other regulations, you may have to comply with the other editions because they are going to supersede what the state edition is adopted. Okay, so again, pay attention to that. All right. One for the road then. I said this was 20 questions, but I gave you one. Here's a bonus question for 21 here. Why is it necessary to coordinate the ITM requirements of NFPA 25 and NFPA 72? Because they're different, yet the two systems work together. Okay, we have systems, like I said before, pre-action systems, deluge systems that rely on the detection system to operate. And we have other situations where fire alarm systems installed in our buildings monitor the condition of the operations within our system. Okay? The position of valves, the status of the fire pump, things like that, water flow in the system, things like that that actually have an interaction where the alarm system is interacting with it. And oh, by the way, NFPA 72 says anytime that a system, an alarm system is installed in a building, one of the conditions that this system will monitor is the condition in the fire sprinkler system. So it's mandated in NFPA 72 that these two systems link together. The challenge is they have slightly different positions on and frequencies on dealing with these interactive components. So it's also, there's two different professions involved. The certified alarm technician and a certified sprinkler inspection technician, maybe two different people, may work for two different companies. You know, not every company down here, a lot of companies have both involved in their ITM divisions, but not always. So you've got two regulations, two different people doing it, two different goals and objectives actually that are occurring for each of these systems of inspection, testing, and maintenance. Two different goals. Two different functions for these and rules that govern their installation. So why is it important? Because they both have to play together. Whether it's one, as I said before, whether it's a pre-action system or a deluge system that relies on it specifically for operation, or it's the system's job to monitor our system, the alarm system. So we've got to coordinate those together. And that's a requirement in the scoping statement of NFPA 25. All right. With that, we're at the conclusion of my prepared remarks. All right, thanks guys.
All right,
Thank you, Jim.
thank you.
Appreciate that.